Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Lisa McCormick, and on behalf of the BSA Theory Study Group and the Bauman Institute, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the life and work of Zygmunt Bauman. This event is the first in a series in which we invite speakers to revisit an influential thinker and consider their relevance to contemporary issues and debates. We challenge our guests to unsettle established narratives about a great theorist and to defamiliarize the classics. Through these discussions, we are aiming to generate insight into old theories and new debates, both in sociology and in society as a whole. To briefly introduce our speakers, Dr. Izabela Wagner is a transnational sociologist and ethnographer. Among her many affiliations, she is Associate Professor of Sociology at Collegium Civitas Cooperative University in Warsaw, Fellow at the Institut Convergence Migration in Paris, Associate Research with the DINAM Laboratory at the University of Strasbourg, and an affiliated member of the Bauman Institute at the University of Leeds. Her expertise on career construction, classical music, and migration combined to great effect in her first book on the making of virtuosos. Today, we will be discussing her most recent book, Bauman, a Biography, which was published earlier this year by Polity Press. Joining her in conversation is Dr. Jack Palmer, who is a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the University of Leeds and Deputy Director of the Bauman Institute. He is the author of Entanglements of Modernity, Colonialism, and Genocide, which was published by Routledge in 2018. In addition to his current research project on Zygmunt Bauman and the West, he is contributing to Bauman scholarship by co-editing the collection Revisiting Modernity and the Holocaust, as well as a series of Bauman's selected writings. I eagerly await the first volume on art and culture that will appear next year. For the next 40 minutes, Dr. Palmer will guide the conversation with Dr. Wagner. Then we will open it up to your questions. Please use the Q&A function to type your question during the session or to like a question that has already been posed to bring it forward in the queue. And please note that this session is being recorded. That's all from me. Over to you, Dr. Palmer.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much for the invitation as well. If I may, I'd like to say a few words about the Bauman Institute before we start. So we are currently celebrating our 10th year. Obviously, some of the plans that we have been curtailed, but nevertheless, we're running a number of events which you can find on our website. We have a new director, so Mark Davis, our previous director, has handed over to Professor Adrian Favell. And I'd like to stress we're I guess, more than a centre for Bauman studies. We're a centre for research and teaching in social and critical theory more broadly. But Bauman studies is obviously an aspect of what we do. And thus, Isabela's book, the first English language biography of Zygmunt Bauman, was really a major event for us, a very exciting event. It's a really brilliant study. I think it's much more than a biography of Zygmunt Bauman. I think it has great importance for contemporary debates and discussions in the sociology of intellectuals and more. It's a book about Bauman's life that I think absolutely changes the way we'll read his work and is a major achievement in that sense. But I guess my first question for Isabella really is how it came to be written, given that as you admit, Isabella, you're not a Baumanist. Your previous book was on the making of virtuosos. So I guess that's a good place to start, really. How did you come to write this brilliant biography of Zygmunt Bauman?
Hello, and thank you, Lisa, for having this amazing idea for the presentation of the book. Thank you, Jack, accepting this discussion with me. Actually, my first book on Virtuoso is the book about the career. My second book, which was published before the first one, in Polish, becoming transnational professional is not about the career of the artist, but about the scientist. And before Bauman, I was interested in careers and in the career of sociologists, because all my colleagues asked me when you will start to work on sociologists. I wrote a long article about Bourdieu. I published it in Polish, and I am not Bourdieusian. So that was for me not an obstacle. I published a book about career of scientists. I'm not genetician. So I'm really using the sociological tools. And in the case of, as well as Bourdieu, as well as for Bauman, it was much more the case, I put the career in the context. So this is why I enlarged my analysis of the career on the interaction between the context and the career path. And I really didn't analyze deeply even the work per se, because as you know better than me, there are the hundreds of textbooks about the work of Bauman, and I'm not an expert in it. So this is my story is about his work and his life.
Yeah. I'm interested as well on the sorts of sources that you drew on. Interested in how
we have the connection, or it is lost.
Hello. Am I still here, Lisa?
You are indeed
Yeah.
here. I think we've lost Isabella for a minute, but I think she will log back in as soon as she can.
Here she is. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I live on an island and sometimes it happens, sorry. So I don't know where I finished, but I think that I finished my sentence. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned how you sort of deploy tools that you've developed in your work on careers, sociological tools, in this study of Bauman. I'm interested in what kind of other sources you used. So there's a lot of archival sources in the book, for example, interview sources. So could you say a few words about that, about your use of material?
Yes, I did the classical methodology. I follow classical methodology of sociologists. So the interviews of people who knew him and people who collaborated, people from the friends and family, but also I extended this this method into historical method. So I went to the archives. And what was very interesting in Poland since several years now, we had this open archives of secret services. And because the huge controversy, especially in Poland, was about the past, the post-war past, and Bauman contribution to imposing the authoritarian regime, I think that it was for me the basic work to go there and to see what's going on in these archives. I was interested in a career, so I would I would learn about this, his university engagement and work, etc., etc. But when I went to this Secret Service archives, I saw immediately that the accusations that were based on some chosen pieces from that particular archive were completely took out from the context. And I found thousands of pieces which prove that he was not the part of the dominant regime, but very early in his life, he was from the other side. He was suspected, he was spied on, and finally he was persecuted. So the story was not at all complete when it was told, accusing him. Yes, so that was, at that moment, I decided to write the book about it, because I found it's incredible that no one before me did it.
Yeah. We'll come back to this later. I think that the question of reception,
yes.
the type of public intellectual Bauman was in Poland in particular, this is the focus of some questions that I'd like to ask in a bit more detail later. I think you sort of touch on my next question in that answer there as well. Really, I think this book is very interesting for the audience that I'd imagine are present today, with a background in sociology in Britain, because I think that the Bauman that is presented, the Bauman that is the sort of central figure of the story that you tell, is a rather different Bauman to the one that we know and discuss. Even in in those many books that you mentioned that are about Bauman's work, a lot of them tend to begin really with the work for which he is best known in the late 1980s. So this is the period widely considered to have been that time at which Bauman rose to sort of global acclaim, which interestingly is actually really after his career, his professional career, because it was when he retired in was it 1991, I think, that this rise to transnational prominence occurs. And your book sort of doesn't go into much detail about this period of Bauman's life. It's really much more rooted in childhood, in his sort of early career in post-war Poland, and there's an incredibly detailed panoramic vision of Polish intellectual culture that you're situating Bauman in. So, as you mentioned, you talk about this sort of the surveillance of intellectual life in the Polish People's Republic. Another really interesting thing that's discussed as well, or that the reader gets a sense of, is how intellectual life worked across borders as well. Bauman was not a nobody in Poland by any means. He had an international reputation. He had links to luminaries in American sociology, in France, interestingly, both contexts where he's not really very well read, it seems, today. So I wondered if you could discuss perhaps your reason for that emphasis, why this emphasis on Bauman's life and career prior to his rise to sort of international fame, if you will.
Yes, thank you for this question. I think that first of all, when I write something, I like to do something that nobody did before me, and something which is interesting, and I know a little bit about that. So the life in Leeds, I think that he had so many friends, collaborators, and these people are writing books, amazing books, that they will do better than me. And this was not really an exciting period about, so it was exciting intellectual life, yes, but historically speaking, it was a peaceful life of a professor, a British professor. So everything which was interesting and known, especially for not Polish public, and even Karol Modzelewski, with whom I did the interview, a big historian and also anti-regime hero, he said that, even for Poland, it will be interesting, because today we have this political, historical memory, which is completely diverse from what was there, etc., etc. So I imagine my reader, it will be a person who is not familiar with what happened in Poland at that time, etc. And we had this conviction, and this is really ethnocentric view, that the theories are international and global, etc. We're frequently forgetting that we're settled in some kind of not only the network, but intellectual milieus, and they're connected, but not the connections are much more complicated than we are considering it. And Poland was very exciting case after World War II, because we've been European before, due to the historical reasons. I am not developing this today, but intellectuals, Polish intellectuals, were educated abroad. This is why after 45, the professors, they're educated in France, in Germany, in UK, in Italy, etc. So the international connections, Bauman benefited from those international influences from the teachers, but also in 56, very early in his university life, just after his PhD, the borders opened. Not for everyone, but for a few. And he was lucky because his PhD mentor was the head of the institution that sent scientists abroad. So he was there at a really particular moment. And we need to think that Iron Curtain was not really the same with the Soviet Union, with the Eastern Germany. In Poland, we were lucky to have much more connections and much more freedom. And this is how he was nourished, and he discussed and he knew people. He was really present during the conferences, congresses, and he was just not the person among the others. He was, when he exposed his works, he was highly appreciated already at that time. So I think that if we could have the internet in the 60s, he could already had much more cover. But at that time, we were only in a very small, networks. And so, yes, I think that the Leeds archive that you know better than me is amazing, the place for future researchers, that they could go there and look only on the correspondence, yes, the letters and the content of these letters. So it will be much, unfortunately, I had no time, and it was at the end of my work on a book, but it is another story and another large book. I'm sure it will be very interesting.
Yeah, so I should say this is these are the Yanina and Zygmunt Bauman papers at the University of Leeds. So the family generously handed over, I think it was about 157 boxes of Yanina and Zygmunt's research materials, correspondence, manuscripts, and so on. And there's discs of material as well. So there's lots of it. That's open, I should say. Obviously. Access is very limited in the current situation, but to anybody interested, I can say a bit more about that later, or you can send me an email and I can tell you about that. But that I guess leads me into the next question. I mentioned Yanina Bauman there. She's of course a major figure in your biography of Zygmunt Bauman as well. You draw frequently on her testimony, in particular A Dream of Belonging, which is the story of her in post-war Poland, written after Winter in the Morning, which was her story of growing up in the Warsaw Ghetto. How important was their relationship for Zygmunt's work and her experience for Zygmunt's work?
It was the most important, in my opinion, even if he mentions, according to the conventions of intellectuals who influenced your work, he will mention the intellectuals, your teachers, etc., etc. What he always did, he always said also what was very nice to say, that my teacher was, and he cited the name of the authors, not the direct teachers, advisors, etc. But I think that the people will say that, yes, it is obvious that for Holocaust and modernity, it was the biggest influence was Yanina Bauman's work, experience, life experience and work. I think that it's much larger than this. They were together 61 years, and they met early in their life, and they shared a lot of experiences. And I think that that is something very difficult for a sociologist to analyze. And I had this problem in my previous work, how to analyze the intellectual, brainstorming of the researchers, for example. Yes, it's perhaps easy when you have a laboratory, co-workers, etc. But those heads in the laboratories, those geniuses, they have also partners, and frequently the partners are very important in this intellectual conversation because of the trust. So that could be surprising, because you will say, but she was not a sociologist. She had her job, and it was different. But the intellectual work is not limited by a discipline. Yes, what is much more important, this is that openness, and what actually Bauman had amazingly, going from history to philosophy and the arts, and the after pop culture, and she was very important in that. I think that this is very difficult to separate and to say exactly what kind of contribution it was, but it was really important. He had the trust in her, and this is very important, to say even the crazy things, to be able to share with one person the craziest idea that they're coming, etc. She also, in the first period of their life, read his drafts. She was excellent writer. So it is something, a lot of us has this problem. Who will be our first reader? Yes, and the editor. Yes, is first very important, and she played this role during several years. So I think that this feedback, this first really important discussion, that is, and obviously all the work on Holocaust and the modernity. That is obvious. For me, this is a collaboration between an ethnographer and a theorist, because Bauman was not a witness, direct witness of the Holocaust, and she was. And she wrote about it. So, and after they elaborate on, and she wrote in a way that ethnographers will be jealous when you can see how she, at what kind of level of the details, but not only details, because it is also analyzed, and this deep understanding of what's going on. So I think that these two books need to be read in parallel, and that is obvious.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you use the word collaboration. I think this was one of the challenges of establishing the Yanina and Zygmunt Bauman archive, because where Yanina's materials began and Zygmunt's ended was often quite difficult to establish. For example, after 1989, the publication of Modernity and the Holocaust, Zygmunt received very many invitations to speak at various places about that book, and he always insisted that Yanina would travel, but also would also present something as well. Would also present her own work, including not only her sort of her testimonies, but her work on gypsies, for instance. She's not often not remembered that she wrote on those kinds of things as well. I guess just to return to A Dream of Belonging, one of the sort of major themes in that book that Yanina wrote was this tension between Polishness and Jewishness in post-war Poland. The tension between an identification with Poland, nevertheless a sort of sharp experience of anti-Semitism, and your sort of key sort of theme on your biography of Zygmunt Bauman is that tension is there in Bauman's work and life as well. And you use the theoretical framework developed by Everett C. Hughes in the kind of Chicago tradition. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. Why you drew on Everett C. Hughes and the sort of tension between a master status and a self-identity, and what that allows you to show.
Yeah, thank you. That is the paper which was published in 45, so over 80 years ago. And Hughes put the very clever example based on the work of his PhD students. Hall, Canadian sociologist, he worked on the doctors, and the paper is called Contradiction of Statuses. And he worked on the American medical students and doctors, young doctors, and their careers. This is always career-oriented paper. And there it was this idea and the example of the Black doctor who is in the 40s in the Chicago area, and a lot of people refuses his status of doctors. Yes, they see in this person a Black male point. And only in the emergency situation, when the white doctor is not here, and this is the life risk of the life, this person could play his role of the doctor. And that is the story of master status. You could have the identity, and you could see yourself, your status is this one as a, for example, scholar, but some accessory that could be principally characteristics, auxiliary characteristics, that was the term of Hughes, will your entourage see you through these characteristics. For example, you are engineer in aeronautics and you are a woman. A lot of people will see that you are a woman, and in that case, you cannot pursue your work, and you are not acting according to the status of engineer in aeronautics. Yes. And it was exactly the case of Bauman. This is a very frequent situation. This is nothing exceptional in the situation of a society in which we have two categories of citizens, and you have this discriminated situation category. They will have trouble to accede to the places to which other part of the society, which is not discriminated, will accede easily, because it is according to the meritocracy in theory. So, and that is the story. And I saw this tension, in, first of all, in the writing of Yanina. This is very well explained, even if it is not show off, you see. This is not a victim story. And I would say that I was, first of all, the reader of Yanina's book, not Zygmunt's book. And this is very frequent case for historians, for example. Historians ignore or read only Holocaust and Modernity book, but Yanina's books, the first book, is very important for them as a testimony of the Holocaust. So here it was my hypothesis, and I started work like this, and during 13 to the 18th, during almost 5 years, I worked alone with this hypothesis, and I was very careful because Bauman is speaking about this, but really not so much. Yes, he refused to play the role of victim. It is not the point. It was the story of Polish history. That's it, point. And I'm very privileged because family trusted me, and I was the full access to the documents, and that was very important document from the family archives. It was the text that Bauman wrote only for family. This is the text in the two parts, and this first part very important, which is ending in 45 in Berlin. This is his story, personal story that you were telling to your grandchildren, yes? And I'm citing it extensively, and thank you very much again, and I will be always grateful to family for having this access to this, because that text, and I found that it is my best text, in my opinion, the best text of Bauman, but I'm looking for his life, first of all, so that is normal. And in this text, he's frequently analyzing this particular situation, who I am.
Yeah,
I'm Jew, or I'm Paul. I'm Jew and Paul, and about the identity. So I'm not going to the details now because I spent several pages on analyzing this and explaining, but it was the most important tension.
Yeah.
And even if some critics, I had already the critics that this is perhaps not the most important in his life, it was other things. No, I think that it was the crucial experience that he get already from the early childhood, his first memories, etc. It was his first experience of social norms. That there are the divisions inside of the societies, and someone is in that box and others are in other box. So his long story of the text and the sharing with people and discussing with people, intellectuals, and finally large public, was about this. We need to stop to divide ourselves into tribes.
Yeah. Yes, this is an extraordinary document. The title, "The Poles, the Jews and I." So there are copies of this in the Leeds archive. Yeah. There's I guess a lot that we can discuss about it. I guess I'm interested in what it reveals about the relationship between biography and thought, because it was written. Am I right in saying it was written in 1986, 1987? So in terms of that collaboration you speak about with Yanina and Bauman, you know, they're engaged in this sort of autobiographical work. It seems roughly at the same time, but also the writing of this text is coeval with what some writers on Bauman have begun to identify as a sort of Jewish turn in his writings. So Brian Chayette and Matt Dawson, who's a previous convener of the BSA theory stream, wrote about this recently. So there's modernity in the Holocaust, most obviously, but also a whole series of articles in the Jewish Quarterly, where Bauman is writing on themes of Jewish history and culture. And the way that we read these texts now with this autobiography in mind is fascinating, because they do have this sort of autobiographical slant themselves. And I've read The Poles, the Jews and I, and I was really struck by how frequently the document evoked themes that were developed sociologically in his own work at the time. So he talks about the assimilation of Jews in Poland at a time of rapid urbanization. The way he talks about belonging to Hatzioma Hatzer, the socialist Zionist organization, as a child or as a teenager as well. He's almost describing it in terms of the active utopia, you know, that comes through in his discussion of socialism in 1976. So it's a really amazing document from the perspective of how we read his work. I wonder whether actually you felt there were sort of methodological challenges with reading that work, because there he is sort of talking about his childhood, his teenage years. He's discussing this central tension in his identity between his Polishness and his Jewishness. Yet, as many of his kind of colleagues from the sort of early Leeds years attest, both he and Yanina were quite silent about their experiences in Poland, say during the 1970s and perhaps in the early 80s. They didn't. I mean, I think Richard Kilminster, who was a colleague of Bauman's at Leeds, said that he didn't know anything about Bauman's past until Yanina's A Dream of Belonging was published. So it's really, I'd imagine, sort of a fairly difficult document to approach methodologically, because he's talking about experiences that he hadn't really talked about before. And I wonder if you could kind of comment on that.
Yes, I think that that is very interesting question. We should mention, first of all, that this text was written in English.
Yes.
Starting with that.
Mm.
And why in English? It is because of the distance to exactly how we can analyze such intimate and such difficult tension. And we need to remember, and I'm starting my book by the events that took place in 2013, and this is anti-Semitic attacks. So we need to keep in mind that it is not childhood only experience. It is the long life story, which never, ever stopped.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll just say
so
that the 2013
the
event
message, yes.
is
So
the one
this
you
is the
begin the book with,
message.
isn't it?
Means that you are living, even if you are protected because it is UK, and you know you have you are a celebrity, you are successful and peaceful, and no, this is in this world. There are some people, and not only 3 of them or 5, that they hate you because of some characteristics that you share with other millions of people, and this is something very important. So I'm not a psychologist, but I'm sure that a lot of people who are working with traumatized persons, traumatized in the childhood, war victims, refugees, etc., they will explain how it worked. For Bauman expressed it through his writings, not directly, but it was the deal in Poland in 50s, and I'm writing about this, that a lot of people even today, they're saying that in 50s we had no anti-Semitism, okay? But why nobody spoke about what happened during the war? Yes. Why no one said that, oh, okay, this is 1/3 of Poland that is missing? I'm speaking about the cities, for example. Yes, 30% of population is not there. Why we had such trouble to speak about what happened even today? So you see this rejection, this refoulement. You stop to speak, to think about it. The Polish version of this amazing text, it was translated by Yanina, the first part, because this text, you have two parts. The first was written in 86. This is, as we said, in parallel or just after Yanina finished her book on the Holocaust experience, her survivor book. And after probably it was some questions or discussions about, okay, what was after, yes, your post-war experience. And this part is much more sociological, means he discussed much more with other intellectuals. We could have impression that he discussed it with friends and he put it on a paper. While the first part is really family oriented, because you have some information that they're really only for the family, not for and that is it was the deal for intellectuals and also for all Jews who remained in Poland. Communists, they said, okay, no more Jews. It was this assimilation by enculturation, as Gross is saying. So this was, okay, you will be equal, but you are no more Jew. And and that was the deal. It is not really curious or surprising that this Jewish turn was later, after Israel and after coming to Leeds. It was certainly influenced or resonating with the general reveal, yes, this interest for Holocaust and testimonies, and the people started to speak, because during the several years no one spoke about this, or a few only spoke about that.
Yeah, I get that sort of leads on quite well to, I think, what will have to be our sort of final final part, if you will, our final question. And I want to return to this issue of reception that you spoke about earlier. Because Bauman, as you say, remains a controversial figure in Poland today. Your book starts with that incident in Wrocław in 2013, the interruption of the lecture by figures of the far right. I think the book does an exceptional job of presenting a sort of sociological picture of the post-war years. It made me think of it. There's a line in one of Milan Kundera's essays where he talks about how man proceeds in the fog, but when we look back to people who lived previously, we don't see the fog anymore. We don't see the sort of network of constraints that people operated under. And I think you do a great job of illuminating the fog, if you will. But Bauman nevertheless remains a controversial figure, and your book, I guess, cannot help but become an effective force in this controversy. So I'm interested in how your biography has been received in Poland, whether you could sort of tell us anything about that.
Yes, this is complex and on many levels. First of all, I think that I would really respond to this question on 1 year when the Polish version will publish, and it will, yes, and it will be published in March, in spring. We are working very hard on that. I translated by myself. This is a little bit different because for Polish audience, I could escape some generalities about the war, etc. But for some sensitive parts, I want again into details, more details. So means that I cited not excerpt of documents, but whole documents. Yes. Why? Because I have in my mind always, it was the law some 3 years ago passed the law that a historian or researcher could be put in a jail even for the insult to the Polish nation. So it is very tricky because until today, no one is in a jail, but this paragraph is there. And if you were looking for the news, Poland is much more popular than 3 years ago. And what we saw progressively going up in fascism and anti-Semitism was the part of the general racism, and today anti-LGBT, etc. So this is not that I'm particularly sensitive and scary, but this is the real phenomenon, social phenomenon. So I don't know how it will be because, for instance, I have this feedback from historians, very good feedback from historians, but from historians working from the same perspective as I'm working. Means yes, it was discrimination, and Polish society has contributed to some extent, and how they contributed to the Holocaust as other societies, French societies, for example. Yes, so this is not surprising. But I had, it was one review which was really unprofessional, which saw only the anti-Semitism inside. Even if, for example, I have very nice chapter on how Bauman worked, and this is sociology of work chapter attributed to the intellectual. So it is not only about this, but it is the very, the sensitive point, and this is what the people could be hurt. And what I was really angry that one person who is smart and read the book didn't finish yet, but said, I think that Bauman was a spy and you're a spy all your life. I said, no, listen, yes, I read, but I maintain my opinion because you cannot go to the, and that I'm really surprised by and I hope it will be not general, but by the wish of people to confirm your previous knowledge. If you change this knowledge, they're really open-minded to say, okay, you are a specialist. Yes, I agree with you. I trust you. And we are unlucky in sociology, in history, etc., because this seems very easy. And the people frequently say, oh, I have another opinion, but this person will be, physician or chemistry specialist or whatever it will be, but they had better opinion than you specialists on this question. So I hope that people will trust me and will really read all these details, because they're here for changing the perspective, because it is nothing worse than giving the victory to the people who elaborated on a bad image, and it was made for purpose. It is the effect of propaganda, yes, anti-communist propaganda, and it is maintained, popularized, and deeply unrooted in a large population. I'm speaking for Poland. And it will be for me the personal failure to see that I cannot change this because the facts are there. I think that this is the tragedy of all scientists, Copernic, if he will not convince people, the future generation, that this is something that inverse vision and the reality of the world, it is a failure. So I hope really for some changes after the reading of this book.
Excellent. I think this is probably a good point to open up to general questions. I think Lisa will be popping back in. I could have continued to ask questions. I think the scope of the book is huge, as you say. All the questions about working patterns and the fact that your biography is going to be translated into Portuguese for a Brazilian audience. So there's all this stuff about Bauman as a global thinker. But for now, I think, Lisa, if there are any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Thanks.
Yes, so please feel free to use the Q&A or to raise your hand, but we do have one first question from my co-convener, Christian Wagner. I wondered if I could ask questions about Bauman's experience being expelled from Poland, transnational lifestyle having contributed to his later thinking on liquid modernity. I wondered what Bauman would say in a world that is ever changing and marked by such ruptures. Why does it also develop the need for the concept of great thinkers like Zygmunt Bauman? In other words, what would Bauman say? Why and how has modernity created the social thinker Bauman?
It was a question, Jack. You would like, it was the question for all panelists. It was said, yes.
Okay, I'm coming back.
Jack, could you start, and I'm coming after, please.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the sort of interesting parallel figures who I mean, it's a beautifully phrased question. I'm just reading it now. One of the parallel figures, somebody who had a similar kind of life and worked in similar areas to Zygmunt Bauman, was Agnes Heller, the late Agnes Heller. She made, well, she wrote a biography of her philosophy. I think he published it in 2010. And one of the things she talked about there, she made a distinction between these different eras of her career. And one of them was called the years of wandering, the years where all of the kind of the restrictions on travel that had prevented her from being a sort of transnational figure previously were lifted, and she suddenly found herself able to travel around the world and speak to different communities, and she talked about the effect that this had on her thought. And I certainly think there's something about the kind of transnationality of Bauman's attendance at various events, and his the transnationality of his audience as well, that affected the development of his thinking. I do wonder as well about how I have been thinking about the idea that a theory like liquid modernity or sort of metaphorical frame like liquid modernity is something that's perhaps sort of easier to develop when you're traveling around and spending lots of time in airports and being sort of ferried from airports in taxis to venues. It seems like the sort of liquidity of that lifestyle of circulating in kind of elite networks lends itself to development of a sociology without a society, which I think, you know, the sort of liquidity frame is. It's not sort of easily rooted in any particular sort of any particular societal frame. So I would agree with that question, you know, that the idea of a transnational lifestyle having affected his later thinking on liquid modernity, for sure. Yeah. Isabella, do you have any comments on that one?
Yes, as probably it is again my a little bit different vision, because we are used to think about this shift in 21st century, yes, the last years of the 20th century. But I think that this feeling of, you know, liquid, actually I am speaking about this in a book, that I found exactly the same term written by someone who experienced the life in a ghetto, Warsaw ghetto, that the previous life is completely disappeared and is liquidized and everything is changing now, etc., etc. So I would like to again connect with the previous experience and again transnational. Bauman, the name of Bauman was written in a German way, first of all, after the family changed. Some family was from Polish, from Russian territories, after Prussian territories, etc. So being in this part of the Europe, you have this feeling of constant change. So the First World War, Poland was created, and after it was changed, and Bauman was at the school, and he learned in Polish, and after in Belarusian very shortly, and after in Russian. So you see, you have 20 years, and you've been at school in under 3 or 4 different regimes. And so you are the part of the transnational, and you see how the categories are not the shape in the boxes, but this is the water. So liquidity, yes. So I think that this is, even if perhaps it was not so precisely, this is why perhaps he had this need for theorizing, for catching, you know, for explaining, for making it clear what's going on. But what's going on, this phenomenon was constant and was from childhood, in my opinion.
Can I come back on that as well? I also think the sort of post-communist experience is really crucial here as well. I think the ideas that sort of begin to develop the liquidity frame are established in some of the sort of early 90s writing on the fall of communism. So in journals like Telos, Bauman was writing, you know, by Bauman standards, quite sort of straightforward political sociology on, you know, on what was happening in Poland, and the sense of liquidity, I think, develops out of that. What's the title of, is it Alexander Yerchuk's book? Everything was forever and then it was no more. I think that's the sort of, I guess, I think a neglected source of the liquidity metaphor as well in Bauman's work.
Yes.
Okay, we have one last question. This is from the director of the Bauman Institute, Adrian. He asks about the idea of Europe on which Bauman spoke in later years. When did he become interested in the potential and limitations of the EU? And how did that thinking develop critically during the next decades?
You know, this is one of the most difficult questions. And I think that last years, and you were in the UK, So our diverse is really difficult to accept. Poland is waiting for being kicked out. And the Europe is, and I live in Italy, that felt really on the beginning, for example, of coronavirus crisis, so really alone. Before that, this pandemics was more general. It was the pandemics of Italian people who were so kissing each other that they are very sick, yes? And I think that we have a lot of problems to fix, and I was very enthusiastic, like a European enthusiastic, and I share absolutely with Bauman this idea and vision, and it would be really a solution for a lot of problems if we were successful in creating this. But even if in his work on the refugees, and I am following this topic particularly, I am really scary about our future. And last days, the news from France against the authoritarian and securitarian regimes, everything what Bauman mentioned in his analysis, we see now much more emphasized. Unfortunately, those negative parts of it, yes. So I am waiting for his promise, because he said that on the long term, he is optimistic. I would ask him one question, if I could now, where it will come, when we will have this optimistic turn, yes? Because, for instance, we're not yet probably in that moment.
Yes, well, and actually there's one last question that we maybe you can touch on very briefly, and then we'll close the session for today. So this question, just building exactly on what you were talking about, how do you think Bauman would have interpreted and explained the public role of scientists today in 2020? And this is to do with the pandemic, right? So to interpret a hyper-liquid society suddenly so frozen in terms of distancing, the invasion of the private sphere by the public sphere for various forms of smart working, and all of the changes that have been imposed on us because of the pandemic. How do you think Bauman would have thought about this? Big question.
Yeah, but Jack, you would like to start? We are discussing it. Do you have any ideas, or?
Well, I think I mean, Isa, with your background in the sociology of careers and science, I think you'll provide a better answer. But I guess there was a sense in, you know, the last book that was published before he died, and Retrotopia, that there was already a sort of a certain, I don't know, to sort of continue the metaphor, a certain solidification represented in the, I guess, this widespread sense of nostalgia, and I guess maybe there's this doesn't bear on the question about science and scientists in particular, but there's perhaps a sense at the moment in all of the kind of discussions about the unprecedentedness of the times that we're living through, that we ignore the sort of the unfolding of processes which were in motion prior to the pandemic. I think it's kind of telling that Bauman wrote about that, you know, the themes of nostalgia, retrotopia, as his last book, because it did signal a kind of I don't know, a desire for solidity that he picked up on. I don't know, Isabella, are you?
Yes, I just want to respond. Actually, through my background of researchers, you know, in the laboratories, it is perhaps somehow biased, but I saw in Bauman, in his life, in his temper and personality, he was exactly as a lot of scientists, you know, life sciences, mathematicians, even physics specialists. He was like this. And I was really surprised that someone told me, it was a scientist, he said, oh, I don't like Bauman, but because this is, they are saying that science is not true, that postmodernity is not believing in science. So I think that the people are completely messed up with the understanding of what he was and what he said, because I think that he will elaborate absolutely now about the coming back, perhaps because of pandemics, the people start to believe, perhaps, I hope, more scientists than politicians. And we saw this in the United States with the elections, yes, how it worked, that a president said the stupid thing, and the scientists were afraid about the consequences of this stupid thing. And we need to be back and trust again the scientists. And I think that perhaps it is really an opportunity for us social scientists to be back, because a lot of things happened now with pandemics, where they shut lockdown, and with the the changing of our life. And we need not only psychiatrists and psychologists, but we need social scientists now for coping with what we experience today. And I think that it would be our big chance, and perhaps this moment which will be optimistic, at least first of all for us. Oh. And social science, the kind of revival.
Yes.
Hope so.
Well, I think we should end on that very positive note. So thank you so much to both of our speakers today, Dr. Jack Palmer and Dr. Izabela Wagner. I highly recommend reading this book. It's absorbing, it's illuminating the fog, as you say. And I think you've given us so much food for thought today. So as people are logging out, I just want to share 2 events that are coming up in the next week that you might be interested in. Thank you so much for joining us today.